Hello, everybody at Ormiston Rivers Academy. Welcome to your newest edition of SMSC/Wellbeing. So let me share my screen with you and we will crack on with a presentation that I have created in response really to everything that is happening again in the world. So see, last week was about the transatlantic slave trade and really focusing on the history of the United States. So that led me to think, how can I talk about the USA and not talk about Britain, which is why we are looking at this today. Now, I did speak with Miss Hayward, who is a history teacher at Ormiston, and she said that they cover this in Year 8 history. So take this as maybe a bit of a revision, a bit of a recap. I could probably touch upon things that history hasn't looked into, because of course I've created this in response to really what's going on today. So really there's been a lot of stuff in the press recently about how we as British people need to understand fully our own history. And as I said before in my previous video, in my school that I went to, you know, our history of the slave trade and how Britain facilitated it was really kind of brushed over. Maybe we spent 3 lessons on it and that was about it. So really, you know, I didn't really have the understanding, but thank goodness for Google and things like that, that we can do our own research and actually educate ourselves, which I think is really, really, really important thing to do during these times of, you know, lots of discourse and discussion about Black rights. So here is one news article. It says, these anti-racism protests show it is time for Britain to grapple with its difficult history. And we've got George the poet. So this is a Black person. He is a poet, and he was on BBC Newsnight yesterday. Reminded me that racism conversations are weakened by gaps in our information. Ideally, we would all leave school with a basic awareness of Britain's leading role in the oppression of Black and brown people, but we're a long way from this. So I know that every year we kind of celebrate Black History Month in October, which is a national thing. So every October we do that. And as I said, in Year 8 it is covered. But I just, you know, there's so much to it. And to be fair, even if we maybe devoted a whole year to it, we probably wouldn't even be able to cover everything, because as we know, guys, history is so rich. But I think it's really, really important that, you know, we are all very, very aware of key events and really how it connects us today and why we have groups of people in Britain who are protesting for Black Lives Matter. And unfortunately, over, you know, this weekend, it has become violent with the English Defence League, a right-wing racist group of people. You know, they've been banned from Facebook. They're not allowed really on the internet at all because of all of the hate speech that they have and many arrests over hate crime. You know, so there was, and obviously the Black Lives Movement said no protesting the weekend just gone to avoid these clashes. You know, and I've kind of woken up this morning with lots of things on my news feed, which, you know, can be scary if you don't quite understand it. So that's why it's really important, as I said, that we do have an understanding. Okay, guys, so we're going to look at the British Empire and how we colonised Africa and Caribbean islands, and what the consequences of that was. So the first colonies were founded in North America, in Virginia, 1607. So the States, USA, and the West Indies, notably Barbados and then Jamaica. Now, British slave traders started to supply African slaves to the British colonies to work on plantations. This meant stealing people from their homes, beating them, and transporting African people in boats, where many died from poor conditions. So basically, guys, we wanted obviously to have lots of different resources. We wanted lots of ownership of different land. British did, and therefore we went and and invaded countries, really. And there was some sort of agreement between British authorities and leaders, like tribe leaders. But of course, this was really done by force. Okay, so Britain's involvement in the slave trade developed further into 1713 when the Treaty of Utrecht granted British slave traders a contract known as the Ciento, which was to trade 144,000 slaves a year to Spanish South America. So that's another part of the world now we are obviously moving people to through the slave trade. After 1700, the numbers of slaves being transported increased greatly. And this was because, guys, lots of land was being discovered by us and by other European countries. And we wanted that land to exploit the resources and bring them back to Britain, so we could trade and we could become a rich and developed country. But of course, there were people living there, indigenous people whose land it was. And unfortunately, lots of those people would die from when British people would come, take the land, and then bring African slaves to the land. Because, of course, when you're moving people about, guys, you've got to think about diseases spreading. And it led to the extinction of lots of indigenous people whose land had literally just been taken over. So around 6 million Africans were taken as slaves to America by Britain. At least 1/3 of them in British ships. It has been estimated that overall about 12 million Africans were captured to be taken to the Americas as slaves. The developing slave-based industries made Britain very rich and prosperous. So, guys, a lot of people saying, why are people protesting in London? Why are people protesting today? And it's because of our history of, doing this. And it's just, it's bad. It's awful. People died because we wanted to become a rich country. People, African people were not seen as people. They were seen as a commodity that we could exploit, as in make them work. And when I say, guys, they're being made to work, they're not getting break time, lunch time. They're not being, treated in a very fair way at all. Like, we've got workers' rights now, which have developed and become much stronger to protect workers. None of that existed. None of it existed. Okay, so this is a slide really from last week, just to kind of put into context again. So 1619, white Europeans invaded African soil, bringing slaves to America. 1672, which is a key year that I wanted to draw your attention to. It was the Royal Africa Company, which was formed by King Charles II, and there he is on our little screen there, and London merchants to provide African slaves for the Caribbean. It was the Caribbean islands that lots of plantations were being created to grow and harvest key products like cotton, sugar, and obviously they needed people to work the land. So they'd go to Africa, steal a bunch of people, take them to the Caribbean and made them work. Really similar to what I said last week, guys, about how we took them to go and work in the United States. We took them to work in the Caribbean. Okay, so the company transported around 100,000 Africans into slavery in the Caribbean between 1672 and 1689. Think about all of those 100,000 people in that short amount of time. We have about 1,000 people at our school, Ormiston Rivers Academy. So times that by 100. Okay, now let's look at the Caribbean colonies. So in the 17th century, sugar cane was brought to the West Indies from Brazil, where most local farmers grew cotton and tobacco. But because of strong competition from North American colonies, so they, obviously what I said last week, guys, about growing cotton and having the cotton fields that many African people would have to go and work, the Caribbean suffered. So they stopped growing cotton, and instead they started to grow and put in place sugar plantations. So slaves were sent to work on sugarcane plantations, where the plantation owners purchased slaves to provide the labour for this work. You know, the plantation owners, it would normally be really rich British people. They would go over there with their family, they'd be in charge of the land, and then they'd bring a load of African people. The plantation owner would then go to like an auction and then would buy these people to work on his land. So almost every island was covered with sugar plantations and mills for refining the cane for its sweet properties. Now, guys, until the abolition of slavery, so the end of slavery, the main source of labour was African slaves. And the increased demand for sugar led Europeans to forcibly transport Africans as slaves. Because before, guys, sugar was seen as a really kind of like a rich person's product to consume. But because so much of it was being created and it was in high demand, it then became quite a common product that everybody used, and therefore they needed more of it, and therefore they needed to grow more of it, and therefore they needed lots of slaves. So vast numbers of African were imported to work throughout the 18th century. Every slave was expected to work, women, children, the elderly. Life on the plantations was extremely hard. As I said, guys, there's no such thing as workers' rights. You know, people would be living in little shacks, you know, no clean water, no facilities. No, they were treated like animals. And this created a constant demand for new slaves, as because it was so hard, guys, a third of newly imported slaves died within 3 years because the conditions were so poor. Okay, so the negative impact of the slave trade on the development of the Caribbean islands. You know, so of course it's not good, guys. So there was long-lasting negative effects which are still felt and experienced today in the year 2020. So as I've already said, the native people, the indigenous people of the Caribbean islands known as the Arawaks were wiped out due to European diseases. And instead these people, there's a photo here, guys, were replaced with West Africans. There was damage to the Caribbean economy due to the concentration on sugar production. So, of course, you know, the Caribbean islands themselves were not allowed to flourish like we were kind of flourishing as a country in Britain, because they were under rule of Britain. So literally everything that they were creating, that they were producing, came back to us in our little boats. I say our little boats, our big boats. Yeah, and this is why the lasting effects of colonisation are still felt, as these countries are still poor. They're still trying to recover their own cultures, which were effectively wiped out by colonial domination. Now, the wealth and the power accumulated by the rich Western world still makes it really difficult for colonised countries to become truly self-sufficient financially. Because it was literally, you know, we go to your land, your people will die, we'll bring over slaves, we'll take the resources, we'll bring them back, and then literally, okay, guys, you now sort yourself out when they finally are declared independent from British rule. Really good film to watch, guys. If you want to learn about India, is the Viceroy's House. I learned a lot of stuff watching that film. I think it's on Sky Movie, so check it out if you can. Okay, so now let's look at Africa. So colonisation was about 1870, but as you recall, guys, we were taking human beings since about 1640. Was it 1640? Let me double check. 1619, with our first kind of establishment, the Royal Africa Company, in 1672. So many African countries, guys, they were not under our rule. So even if someone would make the point of, well, they were under our rule and therefore they were our citizens, so we could take them and take them to... No, that argument is completely invalid, because they weren't. Okay, so Britain wanted African resources as well as its people for manufacturing, and they wanted the products which came from these African countries, such as gold, ivory, salt, and more. They did not hesitate on conquering the land. And another resource was rubber, which was really important, especially for shoes. So, you know, Britain saw Africa, people, and of course the different commodities, which was making some African countries quite rich. The Western world saw it, aka Britain saw it, and we wanted a piece, we wanted a slice. So, what countries did we colonise? So we ruled over Sudan, Kenya, Botswana, Lesotho, Egypt, Somalia, and many, many more. And Great Britain used indirect rule first of all to control their colonies, which basically meant they appointed African tribe leaders to do their work while they safely stayed in Britain. And at first, it was okay. So it increased relations between Africans and the British. But when too many rebellions started, so people started to get quite upset about it, they didn't want this to happen. They were forced to send British soldiers to the colonies and rule more harshly. When we say that, guys, we mean by violence. So how can we see colonial rule in African countries today? And how did these countries gain independence from Britain? So today, English is still an official language of Zimbabwe, Uganda, Zambia, Botswana, Namibia, and Kenya. 8.9% of South Africa's population is white, partially made up of descendants from British invaders. Of course, that's Nelson Mandela, if you remember all of our lessons on Nelson Mandela. Educated citizens led a movement for independence, which led to many different uprisings within African countries in the 1950s. It was during this time, people, as I said, becoming more educated. So, what on earth is going on here? We need our independence. We want to be self-sufficient. So when many British rulers had to go to Europe during World War II, the Africans took the chance to rebel more and create so many protests. It was really difficult for Britain to control because, of course, Britain, we were fighting a war in Europe. So over time, around the 1950s, countries began gaining their independence. So let's look at the negative impact of the slave trade on the development of African countries. So again, here's the list, guys, on the right-hand side of all the different countries. And at one point, around 30% of Africa was ruled under Britain at one time. That's a hell of a lot, isn't it? So it caused a lot of Africans to lose money, homes, and their rights, their lives. And this happened when they were stripped of their resources, and many were, of course, enslaved and taking them away from their families. Today, Africans are much poorer than before due to their lack of natural resources, which had been stolen. And I found this kind of image here on a BBC Bite Size, which I thought was a really kind of a good summary of really how we have Britain has impacted all of these African countries. So see, the rich got richer. There was destruction of traditional cultures. And that's why, guys, we have Black History Month every October to try to reclaim this history that was taken and erased by Britain. Famine, warlords in control. That was when, of course, we were using tribal leaders to manage people, and now these families have become really, really rich, and that's why there's so much conflict in some African countries. And it is really important to note, guys, some African countries now are doing much better and they are beginning to thrive. And so I don't want to do this whole thing of all of Africa is poor. It definitely isn't. But these particular countries that I have obviously identified here, we do need to recognise this is why it's taken them so long, and this is why it's been so difficult for them. The social impact of slavery, the trauma of your ancestry, knowing, if your parents were slaves, increased warfare. So it has been estimated that over 12.5 million, I did say 12 million before, but it is 12.5 million Africans were forcibly removed from Africa and transported across the Atlantic to the Caribbean islands and the American continent. And that was purely to work for sugar, for cotton. The size of the Atlantic slave trade dramatically transformed African societies. These numbers do not include those killed in the process of capture and collection. The slave trade brought about a negative impact on African societies and led to the long-term impoverishment of West Africa. So the image here on the left, guys, is a drawing of the ships coming to collect the African people and then taking them to the Caribbean or taking them to the USA. And here on the right is a mother and child being auctioned. So that's why she's standing on the podium, and of a slave trader selling her, and the owner of a plantation, eyeing up, would she be good on my land? So the role of the slave trade in British industry. So on the right hand side here, guys, I've got pictures of prominent statues that we have in our country of slave traders, of people that facilitated this, who created this, who became very, very rich from this, and in turn made our country rich. And of course, there's this whole big debate right now on, should they be taken down? Now, the consensus of many political leaders is that yes, they should be taken down and perhaps put in a place like a slavery museum, perhaps. But I know there's lots of people on my social media who are kind of protesting, saying, no, this is our history, we shouldn't ignore it. And yeah, 100%, we should never ignore this, definitely not. But I guess you need to kind of be asking the question, what is a statue's purpose? If it's there as an honour, do we really want to be honouring these people? Or is it just pure education? And I guess a whole kind of discussion around that. So guys, the slave trade stimulated British manufacturing and industry through the demand for goods such as plantation utensils and clothing needed for slaves and estates. Now, the Nigerian historian Joseph Inokori suggested that it was the slave trade which allowed the Industrial Revolution to happen. So many, many historians have argued that without the slave trade, the Industrial Revolution, and the way that we are living our lives right now, because it all is like a series of steps through history, we'd be living a very, very different life. So British industry benefited by supplying factory-made goods in exchange for slaves. Profits made in the slave trade provided money for investment in British industry. Banks and insurance companies which offered services to slave merchants expanded and made cities such as London very wealthy. And I guess as well, guys, when we're thinking about, our country, wouldn't be as developed, and maybe that would be a bad thing, could be one potential argument. We need to remember that the people didn't really feel the wealth back then. It was very much, if you were in the aristocracy, if you were in government, if you were the bourgeoisie, the ruling class, the money was up there. The money didn't trickle down to the working class, to the peasants. So again, even then, it's just kind of really going in their pocket. So what should be done? How can we move forward? What kind of world do we want to create, really? Now, I could go on and on and on about this. As I said, there's so many key parts of history that I really feel like I would like to talk about. And of course, I know that you do cover them in history. But of course, I just want to highlight these and make them relevant to what's going on right now. So World War I and the race riots that followed. So many people, unfortunately, who may have a white supremacist view, as in they think that being white English means that you're entitled to more rights than, say, somebody who has black skin or Asian skin. Kind of forget that black people have been on this island for centuries and centuries and centuries. There has actually been evidence found of an African woman from Roman times living in the UK. She was a very wealthy woman as well, because she was buried with lots of kind of jars and jewels, which shows that she wasn't a poor woman. So to kind of think that Britain is a white country, again, is very, very confused and misinformed. Our history of England, we've just been invaded and conquered by so many different cultures. There isn't really an English bloodline, as it were. But one thing I really wanted to draw your attention to was World War I and the race riots. So World War I in our recent history did bring a lot of African and Asian people to our to our land, to British land. So black people were brought over from Jamaica especially to fight in World War One. When soldiers returned to the UK after World War One, there was a job shortage and a lack of opportunities, simply because, guys, we've just come out of a war. Now, some white people made the link that they were not getting jobs because of black people now on British land, and therefore violence towards black communities did follow. Now, they're known as the 1919 race riots in Glasgow, Liverpool, Cardiff, and other seaports across Britain, during which 3 people were killed and hundreds injured. But there were economic consequences too. Many black servicemen and workers found themselves without jobs after a colour bar was introduced in many industries, with white workers often backed by unions refusing to work alongside black people. So a colour bar, guys, basically happened in Britain where white people said they did not want to work with black people, even though they'd just been fighting in a war to protect those people. Okay, we've also got a picture here of a young man. He died during these race riots. Now, he was a serviceman. He just came back from fighting on World War One, and because he was black, and the people of Britain didn't like that, he was killed on British streets. Another thing I thought I'd tie in, because we spoke about Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks last week, was the Bristol Bus Boycott in 1963. And I learnt this new today. So after World War II, black people from the Caribbean and Africa and people from India were asked to come to Britain to help rebuild the country. Again, guys, that is really important to understand. We'd lost so many lives in World War II, as Nazis, Holocaust, all of that stuff, that we needed people to live here, to repopulate and to build the country again, because people had died. So therefore, we invited people to come and work here. So they worked in the NHS and other public sectors, like driving buses. But in Bristol, there was a bus company, omnibus company, run by the council, refused to employ black and Asian drivers, which eventually led to a boycott of buses across the whole city. Now, these 3 men here, Paul Stevenson, Roy Hackett and Guy Bailey, they were inspired at the time, this was about in 1963, by Rosa Parks, who refused to give up her seat to a white man, and therefore they organised the bus boycott. And what I thought was really nice to include, this is a remark from one of them. I've put it in white. It says, white women taking their kids to school or going to work would ask us, what is this about? Later they would come and join us. So again, it's really important, even though, these black men had organised this bus boycott, as in don't use the bus, a lot of British people supported them and obviously joined the bus boycott with them. So students showed support too, and it was backed by the local MP, Tony Benn, as well as Harold Wilson, who became the Labour leader a year later. And the bus company did eventually go, right, okay, we'll lift this colour bar. We will employ people who are from the BAME community. And it was on the same day that Martin Luther King Jr. Had his speech of I Have a Dream. Okay, so this is now leading to the end of our presentation. I do apologise if I've gone over again. I know last week I had like an hour long, and it's because I just didn't want to, miss anything out, because as I said, it's so important that we are educated at this time. It's only through education that we can be empathetic, we can understand, and think about things in a different way. Now, this is Dave. I don't know if you know him, but he's a rapper, and he's got a really amazing song called Black. I'm not going to rap it for you. I will speak it like a poetry. And I just think when I heard it for the first time, I was like, wow, this is amazing. I use it a lot when I'm teaching sociology, and we look at ethnic inequalities. He performed this at the Brit Awards this year, and I have replaced some of the swearing, I do apologise, is rap, with other words which are not swear words. Okay, look, Black is beautiful, black is excellent, black is pain, black is joy, black is evident. It's working twice as hard as the people you know you're better than, because you need to be double what they do so you can level them. Black is so much deeper than just African American. Our heritage being severed, you never got to experiment with family trees because they teach you about famine and greed and show you pictures of our fam on their knees. Tell us we used to be barbaric, but we had actual queens. Black is watching child soldiers getting killed by other children, feeling sick like, oh no, this could have happened to me. Your mummy watching telling stories about your dad and your niece. The blacker the berry, the sweeter the juice. A kid dies. The blacker the killer, the sweeter the news. And if he's white, you give him a chance. He's ill and confused. If he's black, he's probably armed. You see him and shoot. Look, black is growing up around the barber shop. Mummy saying, stay away from trouble, you're in yard a lot. Studying for ages, appreciating the chance you got, because black is in your blood and you ain't even got the heart to stop. Black is stepping in for your mother because your father's gone, and standing by your children when you haven't proven karma wrong. Black is doing all of the above, then going corner shopping, trying to help a lady cross the road to have her walking off. Black is growing up around your family and making it, then being forced to leave the place you love because there's hate in it. People say you fake the stuff, never stay to change the stuff. But black is being jealous. You'd be dead if you had stayed in it. Black is struggling to find your history or trace in it. You don't know the truth about your race because they are erasing it. Black has got a sour flavour. Here's a taste of it. But black is all I know. There ain't a thing that I would change in it. Look, black ain't just a single colour, man. There's shades to it. Her hair's straight and thick, but mine's got waves in it. Black is not divisive. They've been lying and I hate it. Black has never been a competition. We don't make it. Black is deadly. Black is when you're freezing in your home and you can't get sleep but never feeling empty because you got 20 cousins in your country living stress-free, walking for their water, daughter wrapped inside a bedsheet. Black is distant. It's representing countries that never even existed while your grandmother was living. Black is my Ghanaian brother reading into scriptures, doing research on his lineage, finding out that he's Egyptian. Black is people naming your countries on what they trade most. Coast of Ivory, Gold Coast and the Grain Coast. But most importantly, to show how deep all this pain goes. West Africa, they call it Slave Coast. Black is so confusing because the culture. They're in love with it. They take our features when they want and have their fun with it. Never seem to help with all the things we know would come with it. Loud in our laughter, silent in our suffering, black as being strong inside and facing defeat. Poverty made me a beast. I battled the law in the streets. We all struggled, but your struggle ain't a struggle like me. Well, how could it be when your people gave us the odds that we beat? I mean, blaming hell. What about our brothers that are stuck in jail? That couldn't bust a bell. They held a bird and got to live with it. Black is being guilty until proven that you are innocent. Black is saying, free my people stuck inside in prison cells. They think it's funny. We ain't got nothing to say to them. Unconditional love is strange to them. It amazes them. Black is like the sweetest flavour. Here's a taste of it. But black is all I know. There ain't a thing that I would change in it. So, as I said, guys, kind of recap from last week, the Black Lives Matter stuff, we're not saying that no lives matter, all that kind of stuff. It's all about the whole idea that, of course, everybody matters in this world. Everybody matters in this world. At the moment, at this moment in time, black people need help. And maybe next month it's Pride Month and it will be LGBTIQ plus people that will need help. Until really we see less of hatred perhaps in the world. Wouldn't it be nice if we all had a world where we all got along? Now, this is Lavinia Stennett. She is a lady in Britain who has created something called the Black Curriculum, which is an organisation which teaches Black British history in schools. She is campaigning for the Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson, to make it a compulsory topic within the curriculum. So here is a quote from her. "We have existed in Britain and been pioneers, inventors, icons, and then colonialism happened, and that has shaped the experiences of Black people. But that is not all we are." Yeah. So embracing, we need to educate, we need to stand up for our British values. And let me remind you guys, to be British, we respect people. We tolerate people who may be different. We might not, completely understand where they're coming from, but we tolerate them. We have democracy, we follow the rule of law, and we have mutual respect for everybody, and individual liberty as well, freedoms. We respect people's freedoms. And as I said, going back, we respect people's freedoms to the point where, as long as they're not harming anybody else's freedoms, because I know that there's that debate. Well, why can't I say this and I can't do that? You can, as long as it's not going to harm anybody. Because as soon as you harm somebody, may that be emotional, mental, spiritual, physical, then that is a crime. And there are laws that punish. So if you do need any help or advice, remember you can always email us, wellbeing@ormstonriversacademy.co.uk. Talk to your parents, talk to your family, talk to us. If you want to talk online, Childline, Couth, Young Minds. I know Blue Peter has done a really, really good thing around all of this. Go on BBC Bitesize, go on Newsround. There's so much on there at the moment, some excellent, excellent educational resources. I do apologise if I've left anything out that someone could be watching thinking, oh, but what about this? I 100% agree. There's so much that we could be saying right now. But I could be here literally like all day talking about this. So guys, remember to always stay safe, stay alert, look after one another, be kind to one another. What we need right now is kindness and empathy, and just trying to get on with people. Lovely. Can't wait to see you soon, guys. See you soon. Bye.